bottom up, or most of the time, is it just from the leaders of these universities who are just promoting this?
I think it depends a lot. I think it needs both. I asked if the Loyola University outside Chicago, a Jesuit university, if they were represented here, which I gather they're not. But I went last year to their 5th in a row conference on climate change, but in my honor, if you like, or because I was coming, they said this year it's climate justice. So I was very happy about that. But the university itself is giving great leadership on sustainability, and it is a mixture of very inspirational teachers, leadership from the top, but also students who really understand that this is an opportunity to learn to be leaders going forward, whatever the future brings, and in whatever discipline. And they were encouraged to be involved in all kinds of, growing things, converting biofuels into, scientifically at every level. And it was really very impressive. It was more advanced than Trinity is as yet, but we'll get there.
And then another issue might be, is the awareness of university social responsibility mainly local, or is it increasing on a more international and even global level?
I think it's increasingly at a global level, and that's really impressive. And especially, a university like Maynooth that has this strong link with Trócaire, and Trócaire have a very strong link with Irish Aid. I was in Malawi recently. I have been there twice before, but I was there because there was a gathering of those involved in community-based adaptation, which is mainly an Asian, grew out of Bangladesh, and the CBA, the community-based adaptation annual meetings are held mainly in Asian countries or African countries, and this one was in Malawi. And there were about 200 community-based adaptation experts, basically. And that was really very interesting. But with Trócaire and Irish Aid, I went after the conference to a small village, Canyera village, and it was very remote, absolutely no electricity, not a single solar panel, but for several years, Trócaire and Irish Aid had been working, and another Catholic organization more globally, had been working on getting the villagers to empower themselves on water management. There was a sort of higher area, and the water used to, after the flash flooding, would just flow down and be completely lost. And then to capture that, boreholes with water for the village, tree planting, much broader planting of food, because the maize, which was the traditional and is the traditional food, is not a good drought crop, and they get a lot of drought in Malawi. And I think, but what was most striking, and not always the case, was that it took us quite a while to work our way through all these projects, because at each point, at least 3 villages, and it was very gender balanced, had to speak, because they owned the projects. They absolutely owned them. It was their projects. They knew how to run them. They knew how to make sure that they were going to continue in the future, and they were the ones who spoke. And I found that very, very impressive. It was clear that at this village, and then we went to a place where we saw the villagers, mainly women, but there were some men also very supportively, making cook stoves, locally made cook stoves. And there's a very good project which Irish Aid supports, using social, identifying the poorest and giving them vouchers. 10% poorest villagers get vouchers, and these are elderly, women-only households, people with disability. The lowest 10% would get a voucher, and they would get the cook stove free. But then the production of the cook stoves included cook stoves for sale. And once people saw those who were using the cook stoves free, the poorest, and how good they were, because they were much more energy efficient, using only a thin hole, so that you didn't use bad parts of a tree. You could take branches of a tree. It was still using wood, but much less thing. And there was such a learning across, and such a sense really that the village was being empowered. And the next thing they want is the solar panels, the electricity, and that's their ambition now.
But if I can be a bit provocative to go further into the debate, I'm sure that many institutions represented in this audience already are active and have been active for decades in development projects or in social projects.
Yeah.
So one of the main questions can be how this new awareness of university social responsibility is new, according to what has been done before. Is it a kind of qualitative step? Is it more integrative from various perspectives, or is it just a new way to present what has been done before?
I think, to me, one of the important things is that the Sustainable Development Goals are for all countries, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were mainly for developing countries. So universities in the developed parts of the world and in the emerging economies that are, are half and half. They have very poor populations, but they also have quite a bit of wealth, and they emit quite strongly. They have to, the universities need to be leadership in sustainability. What should the country that the university is in be doing, as well as what you're doing to support poorer countries, developing countries, small island states, etc. And for example, Maynooth, which has the Maynooth University has a very good and developed knowledge of climate and is very outspoken about the fact that, unfortunately, my country, Ireland, is not good on climate policy. Now, as a former president, I don't ever really say that much. I can kind of say it to an audience like you. If you don't tell anybody, I said it, But fortunately for me, our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, said recently in the European Parliament, and I was very happy that he said it in answer to a question, he said that Ireland is something of a laggard on climate change. Now, the good thing is that when a Taoiseach currently says it, a former president could quote the Taoiseach. So I don't say it myself, I just quote what our Taoiseach said. But actually, sadly, Ireland is not good. And that is the reason why universities in Ireland need to be even more leaders on sustainability and climate issues. As Maynooth, to its great credit, is a very strong voice in Ireland on climate issues. And I attended a very good conference here with Trócaire and the universities a few years ago on that issue. But as well as that, we need to support developing countries, because I see very often, because I travel a lot, I have a bad carbon footprint, my foundation offsets my carbon footprint, but you have to go to places, you have to be there to persuade or to listen and learn. And I have really seen the devastation. I've been to islands like Fiji and Samoa, and I've talked to a lot of presidents and prime ministers of small island states. When they are hit, as they are now, by these Force 5 cyclones or hurricanes, it wipes out their GDP. It absolutely wipes them. And it happened in Puerto Rico, citizens of the United States, and yet getting so little help in coping with that problem. And so we need a kind of moral leadership, which was given by Pope Francis very strongly in his Laudato Si, but it isn't coming through as much as it needs to come through from centers of learning, which are universities, which are privileges. Third level education is still a privilege and a responsibility. And I think we're not seeing enough of that tangible leadership and responsibility. Responsibility also for the inequalities in our world. I mean, the very fact that half a dozen men own as much as half the world, it's not acceptable. And we need to hear more voices on the values that we need, because we're not hearing those voices enough from certain leadership quarters. We're seeing populism, anti-migrant, anti-refugee, the sort of praise for the strong autocratic leader is going to take us out of our difficult situation. And we need to hear the counter reaffirming the values of the 2030 agenda, of the Paris Climate Agreement, of sustainability, of peace, of hope, and of the migrant and the refugee being the other that we welcome, not the other that we fear.
You've been referring to dramatic situations, for instance, in the Fiji Islands, but we are also here on this stage academics from two countries who are also facing some extremely strong consequences for the warming of the planet. Ignacio Sanchez, please. How do you experience the challenge of university social responsibility from Chile? It seems to be that we have a kind of technical problem with the microphone.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, it's works. Okay.
Thank you. And it's an honor to be with you, Mrs. Robinson. Thank you for this opportunity. For us, I'm the rector of the Catholic University in Chile, and we have this civic engagement or social responsibility for many years, and I guess we have two main focus on that. First, the students, the professors, they really get change after they are committed with the society, after they go to communities, after they spend weeks or months in a project. For sure they get and they give some goods to the community, but their own reciprocity that they have for them is very strong. So when they change, I mean, when they come back to the university, they are different ones.
Yes.
And they recognize that, and also the surrounding group can see a change. And we have a social, pastoral, religious, educational, health initiatives, and so on. So the first thing is to see all these initiatives as a part of the training, part of the formation of our students, because in the future, when they're going to decide in a company, in a business, in a hospital, in a school, will take decisions in base of their own experiences. So that's one part of the answer that I would like to give. And the second one, Pope Francis was in Chile in January of this year, and we have the great opportunity to have him at the university. And in his speech, he said, well, the universities has to be a laboratory of the future. You have to really propose new things, new areas of development, new areas of resolving the problem. So social responsibility and the involvement of our students as well has to be very connected to me to research, and to the research that every university does have in social science, in humanities, in technology, in theology, in order to give to the students the new knowledgement, and for them to apply or to transfer that to society. I don't know your impression about these two issues.
Thank you very much. But then the question I would like to go back to you, Mrs. Robinson.
Well, could I just
please
respond? No, I think you've touched on two really very significant. First of all, students tend to be very idealistic, very open, and when they see a situation of either extreme poverty or deprivation or what, and can engage, it becomes really very important in their lives. And I think it's great that universities encourage that kind of social work and responsibility. And secondly, I just wanted to tell you a rather irreverent story, if I may. I know two of your former presidents very well. Michelle Bachelet, obviously we worked together a lot on the UN, etc. And I've been to Chile when she was president. And Ricardo Lagos, before her, is one of the elders that I belong to. And when we met when we met Pope Francis last November, we were talking about a whole range of issues with the Pope, the elders, Kofi Annan, Ricardo Lagos, Lacto Brahimi, and myself. And we had told Ricardo Lagos that we must speak in English because he couldn't be speaking in Spanish and we wouldn't know. And the Pope had a South African priest who was his translator, and he spoke in Italian and was translated. It was clear to me, and that the Pope understood our English very well. And then at the end, and this is the irreverent moment that I really enjoyed, Ricardo Lagos said to the Pope in English, Your Holiness, what did you think of my English? And the Pope, in a very Argentinian to a Chilean way, said, well, it's better than your Spanish. I thought that was really good. Sorry, you want
No, but indeed, from your experience, The question might be, in the perspective of social responsibility, how research did impact or is impacting the issue of social responsibility, because it seems that in an institution it's been to be cloisoned or separated from one or the other, to say priority in research and possibly impact on social responsibility.
I think perhaps the pure research universities get a bit distanced. I mean, that's an overstatement. Maybe there are some that are, I mean, I think those that are focused on sustainability issues probably stay close to those issues because they have to. But a research university can get a little bit remote. I think if you've got that teaching, that linking with students, that interface, and if you're reaching out to poorer parts of the community, and then that research is coming back, exactly as the Pope said clearly when he was in Chile, then I think you get that interaction. It becomes research that is very linked to people's lives, which I believe is very important, whether it's research on social issues, on health issues, on equality, on air quality, on whatever it may be. As long as it's the focus is very much to better people's lives, to provide direct opportunities for better quality of life for people.
And then we can turn to Craven from the Australian perspective, where, for instance, there are major challenges are being faced in Australia, climate, migrations, etc. So from your perspective, how do you approach these issues of university social responsibility?
Well, I mean, we have some pretty spectacular and well-known challenges. Most of you are probably hoping to visit the Great Barrier Reef sometime in the next 2 months before it disappears. We've had extraordinary bushfires. It's currently winter and we're in the middle of our umpteenth drought. And can I tell you on behalf of all of the people of Australia how delighted I am to see that Ireland is in drought, so that we're not alone. So we have all of those types of problems. I think the really interesting issue is the whole question of whether universities do social responsibility, because I can tell you that in Australia and in various parts of the world, if you go to my colleagues and you say, what do universities do? They'll say, well, we teach and we research. And if you say, and there's a third thing, they'll look at you and they'll say, and we make money. Now, that's a real problem if there isn't that fourth dimension of social responsibility, of which sustainability and climate justice is one aspect. Now, I'd even go further than that. I would say that to some extent there's a direct correlation, sure not in relation to Trinity, between, in a sense, the length of establishment, the comfort zone and the wealth of universities and that attitude, and that attitude carries on into the type of research they do. So to take examples of highly practical research versus pure research, truth is, of course, you can't have highly practical research without pure research as well. But we have a nurse researcher who's into stroke care and prevention. And she was quite interested. There was a drug recently brought on in America at a cost of billions of dollars. To prescribe it, you had to be wealthy and indeed live in the right country. And it was an incredibly effective drug, and it cost a fortune, and it increased health outcomes by 14%. She had a look at that, spent months researching, and came up with a regime of nursing that involved a program of how often you checked temperatures, how often you gave saline, how often you gave aspirin, how often you reported this. It cost nothing and increased outcomes by about 70%. Now, there are universities who, if you told that story to, they'd say, well, that's not real research. Well, that is real research. I think one of the questions is, particularly as Catholic universities, are we concentrating on the right areas in the right way and for the right people? And when we think about sustainability, do we think of it as widely as we should? I think climate sustainability is incredibly important, but it's a subcategory, if you like, or the brother of human sustainability. It's what Pope Francis says, I don't want you to like the poor, that's taken for granted, I want you to be with the poor. And that's a real question about research as much as anything else.
Thank you. But maybe I would like to raise a last question to three of you before addressing the audience and giving the audience a possibility to raise questions. Now that all three of you experienced the idea of university social responsibility, how do you evaluate the impact so far? Is it just a kind of short-term mainstream, or do you think that what you have been doing since now is going deeper into what it can be as far as an impact is concerned?
Well, I could answer that very narrowly by saying, in talking in universities about sustainability and encouraging them to divest, encouraging them to take the 2030 agenda seriously, encouraging them to have that kind of social responsibility, I think that probably the main outcome I've seen is the two centres actually for climate justice, because they have students, PhDs and master's students who are really focusing on the injustice of climate change, the need to address how to make sure that the benefits of clean energy get to the developing world. And there are kind of projects of outreach now to bring clean energy to those more than 1 billion, as we know, in our world who never switch the switch for electricity, and the 2.7 billion who still cook on dirty cook stoves. And I mean, it's a very high proportion of our 7.6 billion world that almost 3 billion still cook on dirty stoves, on wood and coal and animal dung, ingest indoor smoke, and more than 5 million a year die. So the health benefits of getting that out. And it's to me something that I find I get angry about, that we're not actually taking that seriously. The 2030 agenda had two very good phrases in it. Leave no one behind, which is a very important one. And the one that I've never heard before in an international agenda was prioritize the furthest behind first. I really like that. If only our development policies of countries had prioritized the furthest behind first, I think we'd have done a much better job. And it's that furthest behind. If they had access to renewable energy, poor communities would take themselves out of poverty extremely rapidly. They're trying to do it at the moment with the mobile phone. That's the one way of trying to be proactive they can do. But it would be so easy. Instead of all this, we get tied up in processes. But it is hard to measure impact. I mean, my feeling is that Catholic universities should be in the lead because of what the Pope said in Laudato Si, in being real leadership for sustainability in the full sense, and more and more not being zones for privilege, but reaching out to communities and making that knowledge base accessible. The opportunity to have that third level education is extraordinarily important, and it's still a privilege.
Thank you. Ignacio Sanchez.
Yeah, we have seen in two main areas, I guess, some changes. One is because we get every year students that are more and more involved in the conscience, in the sense of sustainability and social responsibility. So they come from families, they come from environment, and when they get to the university at 17, 18 years old, they already have this sense of urgency. As Mrs. Robinson was saying, in our case, about 10 years ago, the students, they told us, well, how come we don't have sustainability in our developmental plan for the university? So they were the one that started with the topic, and they put over the table as an emergency issue. That's one theme. And the second one is that if you see the orientation of the research today is multidisciplinary in many cases. It belongs with different centers. It attracts international and nationally different centers or universities. And there are a lot of focus on sustainability, on global climate change. If you do a cut today compared to 5 or 10 years ago, there is a huge change in the way the researchers, the professors see their own role in changing the world. So those two issues, I guess, we're in a pathway.
Thank you, Ignacio Sanchez. Greg Craven, please.
I think in assessing the impact of universities on things like this, you have to take account of the enormous advantage we have in terms of time frame. Governments last for 3 years or 4 years or 6 years. You know, directions in the UN may last for 10 years or 10 minutes. We're Catholic universities. We're the oldest continuous institutions in the Western world. And if we're proper universities, we're thinking in timeframes of 50 or 100 or even more years. Now, if you're thinking in those terms, you can actually think of attitudinal change, not just doing one good thing that has marvellous results, but changing the attitudes of thousands and of hundreds of thousands of people, not just your students, but your societies. And I think that's something we've got to be terribly conscious of. I think I recall that Your Excellency was once a constitutional lawyer, which I have to say, as a constitutional lawyer, is the highest calling known to God. But one of the great things about universities, I believe, is that in every state they have a constituent role, which is that universities are part of the constitution of all states because they are the defined, endorsed critics of every state. They exist to be annoying and irrelevant and impertinent. Now, if you can have them doing those things about the right things and on the wrong subjects, that's the opportunity, I think, for literally continental change. And it worries me across the Western world that as universities have become increasingly dependent upon government funding, where they can face punishment by government, they can fail in that function.
Thank you, Greg Craven. And now, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the floor is yours. Who would like to raise a question? Please, could you just present yourself and make your question as brief as possible so that we can provide as many possibilities. We have here a first intervention, please. Can anyone provide a microphone from?
Merci beaucoup. Excellence, je suis heureux de vous retrouver ici parce que vous avez dit que vous visitez les coins les plus pauvres et vous avez été à Goma en RCD, au Congo, pour visiter les gens en difficulté. Je me rappelle bien, je viens de Goma, Jambo. Alors, tout de suite en terminant, vous avez dit que l'accès à la connaissance est une nécessité. C'est vrai que vous avez parlé beaucoup de réchauffement climatique, du développement durable, mais je crois qu'en tant que commissaire aux droits humains, vous savez qu'un des droits les plus importants, c'est l'accès à l'éducation. Sans éducation, on ne peut pas lutter contre le réchauffement climatique. Sans éducation, on ne peut pas accéder au développement durable. Or, le plus grand problème de la majorité de l'humanité dans laquelle nous sommes, c'est des gens qui n'accèdent pas, comme je disais ce matin, au bien de la connaissance de la science. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez, effectivement, dans le cadre de Laudato aussi, du partage, pour qu'effectivement, même les plus lointains, comme ces villages que vous avez visités, accèdent à la connaissance, accèdent à l'éducation, et comment vous espérez un jour l'équilibre mondial dans ce sens-là?
Merci. Je vais répondre en anglais, si vous permettez. It's true that I have been to your country, to Goma, and to other parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I had my role as a special envoy to the Great Lakes, apart from earlier visits when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights. I absolutely agree with you about the vital, the right that links with all other rights of education. It is such a core issue. And education of girls within that is such a core issue. And it is still I think, really sad to see that girls drop out of school. They drop out because they have household responsibilities. When there is, even the climate impacts affect girls' education. They are kept at home because they have to go further for water, further for firewood. Or when they get to puberty, they're embarrassed because they don't have pads, the school doesn't cater well, and many, many girls drop out at that stage. And so education is absolutely vital. I very much support the focus on education, the Global Alliance for Education, the way in which the Sustainable Development Goals, several of them relate to the importance, but I would put the real emphasis on girls' education. The elders had a very big push a few years ago to tackle early child marriage. It is such a deprivation of rights for young women. Not just the right to education, because many girls drop out of school when they become pregnant. They're not encouraged to stay in school. And then they may die giving birth, or they're not equipped to be mothers. And it has such a bearing on all of those rights. When we started our campaign, I remember Archbishop Tutu, who was then our chair, being absolutely shocked when he realized that about 10 million girls a year are married well before they are able for that marriage. And this was shocking to him, and we started and helped to create a network of networks now, which is called Girls Not Brides, trying to say that girls should stay longer in school. So in responding to you asking and asserting, as you did, the importance of education, I have to say within that, incredibly important is the girls' education, and that's still not fully guaranteed because of social barriers, family barriers, health barriers, when the girls start menstruating, and these are all key issues. But I follow your country very closely, including at the moment, and I hope for better things for a great country that is very important for the continent of Africa. So.
Thank you. We have at least another question.
João Vilachá from Portugal. Excellency, thank you for being here with us. Following this question, one thing, I just met someone very touched by what I'm going to say. The problem I'm going to mention is the problem of the genital mutilation of millions of girls, perhaps women too, but girls. I think it's a very serious problem. And I have the impression that many times the most serious problems, and I consider this one of a very serious problem, get under the rug because, our attitudes, we have to respect traditions, there's a different motivation, all that kind of thing. My question is, do you agree that, well, I'm sure you agree that this is a serious problem, but what can be done and what role could universities play in the fight, frontal fight against this malignous, horrible thing?
If I may just add something to this question, because it goes extremely fundamentally. You see, how far actions from university social responsibility can have an impact in the change of mentality, not only in physical conditions, but also in mentality, because that goes even further than that.
I learned from a few of the special rapporteurs in the UN when I became High Commissioner how to address the problem of early child marriage and the problem of female genital mutilation, genital cutting. The most important thing is to say these are harmful traditional practices. Harmful traditional practices, not culture, not tradition, harmful traditional practices. And that the way to tackle them is from within a village, within a community, with men, with imams, with girls themselves, the parents, and that's where in Senegal, for example, the very successful programs, because it's that holistic approach, and because affirming all the time, this is not something, it's like And apartheid was a harmful traditional practice. Slavery was a harmful traditional practice. These are harmful traditional practices, and that's the way to kind of get. And I think universities can play a very significant role in making it clear that women in particular have to be empowered to address this issue, but men need also to be strongly supportive. And I just think even that starting point of characterizing properly harmful traditional practices is a great help, because then you don't have that ambiguity of whether you're interfering with somebody's culture or tradition. It's not. Clear, bang. These are the human rights of girls, and there should be no ambiguity about it at all. But the way of doing has to be supporting and empowering from within and building the strengths of a community to address this in a holistic way.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, the person over there. Yes, I'm afraid you have to run.
Okay.
I'm John Joseph from Sophia University, Tokyo. Your Excellency, I would like to ask the following question. From your global experience of many years, what would you consider as the most serious tragedy that the humanity faces today? And what would be the Catholic universities as a unit can do to respond to such a great tragedy that the humanity faces? Thank you.
That is indeed a fundamental question.
It's a very big question in that sense. In a way, I think it's the erosion of a solidarity and a sense of connection between people. Because I'm, a human rights person by instinct, and because I served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights during the 50th anniversary celebration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think very sadly we're coming up in December to the 70th anniversary, and yet those values are more challenged, more disputed, and there's a kind of contradiction, because in 2015 we had a very good year for multilateral cooperation. We had the 2030 agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals, making it clear that no country is living sustainably at the moment. Every country has to make an effort with these 17 sustainable development goals. And the fact that 193 countries negotiated that text was itself a very big step forward. Leave no one behind, prioritize the furthest behind first. And then we had the Paris Agreement, which spelt out what do we mean by sustainability, that we have to be well below 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial standards and work for 1.5 degrees so that small island states don't have to go under. And I often tell the story, and I just tell it briefly here, of being in Paris when the gavel came down on the Paris Climate Agreement. Was anybody else in Paris? Yes, a couple of hands. A couple of hands. Do you remember the emotion? I remember it very well when the gavel came down. First of all, it was cheering, and in part cheering the platform. Secondly, it became, after the clapping, it became cheering. After the cheering, it became hugging. People started hugging each other. And then people started crying. Now, why was there such emotion? Because although the Paris Agreement is not a strong agreement, it's a very fair agreement. It has language in it about human rights and gender. It had the goal that was sought by the small island states and the least developed countries, the need to have working for 1.5 and staying well below 2 degrees. That was a much stricter standard than before. And since then, and it seems, it almost seems a long time ago, but it was only a couple of years ago, we've had countries assert America first, other countries first, the way in which Europe is treating refugees and migrants, dying coming across the Mediterranean, the fear, the link between refugees and migrants and terrorism that has been made in so many contexts. I was in Jordan not long ago with a fellow elder at a children's summit, And Jordan has a huge number of Syrian refugees. Most of them are not in camps. They are in the homes and villages, and they go to the schools with the Jordanian people. And I asked a number of Jordanians, and I got more or less the same answer from everybody I asked. Oh, but the Syrians are our neighbors, and when they're forced to leave their country, they are our guests. And that's just exactly the right attitude. But it's not what we're hearing. It's not what we're hearing in Europe, sadly, and it's not enough what we're hearing even in this country, where there are very good people working on migrants and refugees, but our policies are still not open enough and not providing. And I'm sorry, if I may say so, that Australia has said it won't sign the Global Compact on Migration.
On the other hand, we didn't elect President Trump.
But no, I mean, I think what I would look to Catholic universities, but universities more widely, is to stand by those values of 2015 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not Western or not Eastern or not, it is, you know, the culture for the whole world. And I had an interesting experience recently. It wasn't a job I wanted to do, but I was somehow boxed into it, of chairing a high-level panel for reform of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. And the outgoing chair of the DAC had put together a very good high-level panel, and I had really good representation from China and India. And in our discussions, it was very valuable to hear the way that a former foreign minister of India and an academic from China said, "Don't you understand that the world has changed since the 2030 agenda? It's no longer that we have a set of values from the West called the DAC. We must be much more open and humble." And we framed our report in that way, and I think it had quite an influence on the OECD. Just to hear that this is now a global agenda. Everybody has to be involved in it. And I do think that universities, and it's much broader than climate, it is that broader human sustainability in its very broadest sense, and sustainability linked to, we are part of the ecosystems of the world. We are linked, as Pope Paul put it, Pope Francis put it so well, with other creatures. And you know, I love a saying of Barbara Ward, who established an organization that I chaired for a few years called the International Institute for Environment and Development, based in London. And I gave the first Barbara Ward lecture, so I had to do some research on Barbara Ward. And she had a lovely phrase about that humans must learn to tread lightly on this earth as other creatures do. And I thought it was a lovely, tread lightly on this earth as other creatures do. And you know, we have a lot to learn from that. Yeah, okay.
Now we have the possibility for last question, please. Oh, okay. The last two questions then. First, to remain within the time limit.
Gracias, Excelencia. Fernando Sánchez, rector de la Universidad Católica de Costa Rica.
Sorry, but as we don't have any...
I can do it in English, no problem.
Could you raise it in English?
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Should I speak in English?
Please.
Yeah. Your Excellency, Fernando Sánchez, rector of the Catholic University of Costa Rica.
Okay.
From an academic and also a politician point of view, during these last years, the Pope has been raising his voice talking about human trafficking, right? A tragedy to humanity, he says. And he's even been telling us, Catholic universities, to do something about migrants. And we're trying to do something. Just recently, he told us. However, on the other hand, many governments seem to be just blocking the frontiers and trying not to do something the way the Pope is saying that should be done. So we're in the middle of this problem, dealing with migrants and their needs, and with public policy at the same time. How can we tackle this problem, both in the face of governments and in the needs of the migrants? Thank you.
Yes, I agree with you that human trafficking in the context of the forced sort of mobility. It's forced in so many different ways. It may be conflict, it may be economic necessity, it may be the push of climate change, but people are forced to be on the move. And within that, you get the horrible problem of trafficking, you get the horrible problem of parents being separated from children. And I think what is really most needed now is to somehow understand our absolute requirement to manage this problem much better in the different contexts around the world, which are different. In Costa Rica, it's different from in Europe, but nonetheless, the need to manage is the same because we are going to see an increase in human mobility. That is one of the realities of our climate-stressed world. I mean, there are predictions that we could have 100 million, maybe even 200 million migrants well before the end of this century, maybe as early as 2050 if we don't get things better. But certainly we will have more mobility. And, you know, in this country, we have an acute memory of our Great Famine in the 19th century, Ungurta Mór, as we call it, the Great Famine, where so many people were forced to leave from the sheer necessity to stay alive because there was famine in Ireland. The potato crop had failed for its third year. And I love the story because it's a very human story, and it's well known in Ireland. Of the famine started in 1845. In 1846, those who were strong enough began to leave in what they called the coffin ships to America, to England, of course, to Canada, to Australia, just desperately leaving this country. Others were going to workhouses, many were dying. 1847 was the third and worst year. And in the spring of 1847, the Choctaw people were meeting in Oklahoma to mark the 10th year of being driven from their tribal lands through what they call the Vale of Tears. And we're not quite sure how they learned about an island where people were starving. We think it was a passing priest that may have told them. And the Choctaw people in the spring of 1847 raised $173 for the relief of Irish famine victims. And we know that that money was sent, and we know that it was dispersed in Ireland because the Victorian regime at the time was very good at bookkeeping. So they noted it coming in. And 100 years later, as President of Ireland, I went to Oklahoma to thank the Choctaw people for the fact that they had helped my people in our desperate need. And in fact, I'm an honorary chieftain of the Choctaw people. That's like, I didn't realize how useful that would be to me only 6 months later, because I was in my final year as president, and then I became UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I discovered that I was going to be the coordinator of the Decade of Indigenous Peoples worldwide. And I kind of said, what does that mean? What is coordinator of indigenous? Coordinator of more than 400 million people worldwide who characterize themselves as indigenous, who were involved in the long attempt to get a declaration for indigenous peoples. And they would meet annually and come more often, and they looked to the UN. And I was given a speech for the opening of this long-running, yet again, a working group on this declaration. And the speech I was given, I couldn't even understand myself. You know, it was full of UN speak, full of UN acronyms and things. And so I went in and I told that story of my people and the Choctaw people, and that resonated and was understood. We have to somehow go back to connection of people. We've had our desperate times where we had to emigrate. Other countries are having their very severe times. We have to be more human. We have to somehow, and also migrants coming to a country is a great resource for that country, a great richness for that country. I was talking to somebody today who was going for medical treatment. He said, luckily I have this wonderful Syrian doctor. You know, the great benefit to countries of those who come in and make their lives in the countries. But we've lost that humanity now. Somehow terrorism has frightened people, and we're afraid of the other. And maybe I'll end by saying, the elders, we had a year-long program to mark Mandela's 100th birthday just the other day, where we were in Johannesburg together. For the year before, we had a campaign of walking together in the other's shoes. And we divided the year into 4 themes. We began with peace, and then health, and then justice at the beginning of this year, and then equality leading up to Mandela's birthday. And we identified 100 communities that live by Nelson Mandela's values, and we call them sparks of hope. If you go into the Elders website, theelders.org, you'll see the Walk Together campaign and these 100 sparks of hope. And the Elders shone a light on them. There are communities all around the world who are living these values. We need to highlight them more. We need to bring out, but most of all, I think Catholic universities are in a good position under the leadership of Pope Francis to reaffirm, what the Universal Declaration said. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration is very simple. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. People on the move, migrants and refugees, are human beings with dignity and rights, but we don't respect enough now. And I have a great friend from Costa Rica, Cristiana Figueres. We work together a lot. I know from her some very good things about climate in your country. So.
Thank you. And now the last question, please.
Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Fadi Halabi. I'm from Lebanon. I have a tricky question. It's about the political responsibility of the university. In which extent do you think that university, they can take a firm decision, stand against any alienation or occupation or social injustice coming from a regime, whether it is external or internal? And I will give an example, practical example from my country, Lebanon. When I was a student, I was studying in St. Joseph University for the Jesuit. And for 30 years, we had Syrian troop in our country, and they withdrew in 2005. And many of my people in my country, they consider this presence as occupation. So we had like intellectual resistance, a massive one. One of them was the student. And the St. Joseph University was the only university in Lebanon who declared in a very clear way against this presence and occupation. And even the rector in his annual talk and lecture, he was analyzing in an academic way what it means to be a free country. So my question is, do you think that university can take such a firm position when it comes to such a violation of human rights? Because sometimes it is not easy to position yourself in this way.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and actually very topical question because there is, I think, an increasing concern about what is happening in the occupied territories and the recent proclamation of a Jewish state in a different way. I mean, these are all very, very worrying. I think the universities should have and must have a moral willingness to express a voice and willingness to take a stand on those issues. I think there's also a strong argument about not boycotting at the academic level, and I would be on that side of the argument, because I think to boycott academically is to defeat the discourse, to defeat the opportunity for exchange. But I do think universities need to speak out on these issues.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think when I was listening to what you have been saying during this meeting, the key words that come back to my mind is that from university social responsibility to further solidarity. And I think that is definitely one of the key words that we've been addressing to us tonight. So Mrs. Robinson, Ignacio Sanchez, and Greg Craven, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Michael.